Hello, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Adam Golov, Marketing and Communications Manager at Data Conversion Laboratory, and I'll be your moderator today. Before we get started, I wanted to let you know we will allow time at the end of the webinar for questions and answers. So please write your questions in the chat area as they come to mind. If we don't have time to answer them all, we'll make them available on our website. Next slide, please. For those of you who are not familiar with DCL, we convert and organize content to create electronic documents, populate databases, publish on the web, and basically get it ready for tomorrow's technology. Next slide, please. DCL services help you refine your document conversion strategy, identify document redundancy, extract metadata, and transform legacy and future documents for real needs, today and in the future. Next slide. We serve a very broad client base, next slide, spanning all industries. Next slide, please. Today, we are thrilled to introduce Amber Swope, DITA Specialist of DITA Strategies. Amber is an internationally recognized expert on a Darwin Information Typing Architecture, DITA, who specializes in helping teams develop their information architecture and implement DITA. With over 20 years of experience in the information development field, and 12 years of DITA expertise, Amber helps teams design and optimize their environments to improve efficiency and reduce costs. When she's not busy helping to change the world with XML, she could be found playing soccer, walking her pupster, and enjoying Portland, Oregon. Without further ado, welcome Amber.
Thanks, Adam. Well, that's my bio, so I'm going to hop right in to our information, and we're going to start off with a quick poll, because I would like to know how much you guys know about DITA, because it makes a difference on the amount of explanation that I'll give for some of the more technical DITA items. So the poll is open. And while you're filling in your answers, this is going to be a presentation around how you can optimize DITA for translation. Some of the items that we'll be talking about are things that you might not associate with translation, but are really about information architecture, which I believe is the foundation for all your content success. So I just wanted to give you a little heads up about that. So how are we on the poll?
So, Amber, I just closed the poll, and we have 32% have indicated that they're advanced. 26% is split between 26% saying they're an expert, 26% saying they're a novice, and 16% saying they're intermediate.
All right. Well, that's good. So we have a nice spread. So for those of you who are a little bit more experienced with DITA, you'll just have to nod along as I give you some of the more detail if you already know it. So I'm going to hop right in and talk about how I approach this. And I think of things, of course, in workflows, because that's who I am. I'm an information architect. I'm pattern-based. And so I start with figuring out, well, what does DITA even provide me? Then when is my responsibility to translate the content? How does using the appropriate DITA elements help me with translation? Are there any parts of my content model that are ambiguous? And what is the impact of inline referencing when it comes to translation? So with no further ado, I'm going to move on. So quickly, for those who aren't DITA experts, DITA is the Darwin Information Typing Architecture. As you can see, it's a modular structured XML framework. The important thing that I want folks to know is that DITA is an architecture. And I said the good news is that DITA is an architecture. That means that you have multiple ways to do what you need to meet your requirements. The bad news is that DITA is an architecture because you have multiple ways to do what you need to meet your requirements. And so when you are designing your implementation, you have choices to make. And if you are looking to leverage DITA for translation, one of the things that you need to be aware of is how those choices around your architecture could impact the efficiency of your translation. So I'm going to talk about what DITA provides in specific around translation support, and then how the DITA sorting support also helps you with translation. So with a translation, it's really around the attributes on the elements, and I'm going to talk about these three attributes. So the obviously named translate attribute indicates whether or not an element should be translated. And before you go, oh gosh, I have to specify that in every element, the answer is no, you don't. The good news is that the default value is yes. So what that means is that you are obligated to indicate when an element should not be translated. So for example, DITA is a keyword in this example, which means that even if you're translating this to another language, you would not want the text, capital DITA, to be translated to that other language. And you can see that the translate attribute is set to no. The XML lang attribute specifies the language for the content. And so you can see, I'm going to skip down to the example where it says translate equal no, and it says, oh, this is the language that it appears in because we are indicating a German word, nein. Now, the question of folks say, well, where should I set this? Well, in the example, I have it set at an element level. Ideally, you would set the XML lang attribute at the beginning, basically the root element of every map or topic. This way, the processors know, hey, everything within me by default should be in this language. This is the language that we're starting with. And then if you have to override at the element level, you can. The dir attribute. And of course, I'm so juvenile, I think that dir is so funny. The dir attribute specifies the directionality of text. So I guess I should call it the directionality attribute. In the example, you can see that in this case, we're going with the default, which is left to right. This is important when you need to override it to say, hey, the text that I need to show in this translation means that you have to process it the other direction. And there are specific languages that need that type of directionality. And it isn't, you can set it for the entire topic, but it's most important for the processor to know when it's rendering table columns and definition lists, because that directionality of the text is really important in how people actually scan and look at that information. So those are the attributes. And let's talk about some of the elements that we have at our fingertips for controlling how things sort. So the obviously named sort as element specifies the sort phrase when the base sort phrase is not appropriate. And of course, the first question you ask is, well, what's the base sort phrase? And that is the inherent text on which the element would have naturally been sorted. And I'll give you some examples in a minute, but there's something really important is that you need to not only know how you're going to use this in your architecture, but you have to do some tests to understand how your processors will render this output. One of the important notes in the spec is that different processors could render this output differently. So with DITA, we like to be able to say that it's an independent architecture and has no implication on the tools that you use. However, in this case, you would want to do some tests to make sure that you're getting the output that you want. Now, you can specify the sort as element in two different ways. You can do it using the text within the element, or you can use it as a value attribute. And I'm going to show you these two examples. And so if you do it within the element, in this case, we're looking at a gloss entry where, if you can see in the display, that it's actually two characters. And the definition of this is big, but we don't want it to sort by these characters. We want it to sort essentially by da. So we need to tell the processor, hey, this is what we want you to sort it as. And the output, this display that's shown at the bottom, can be generated from either of these two ways of sorting, of specifying the sort order. So the first example shows it as a prologue with the element, sort as, with the text da within the element. The second has the sort as element as part of the glossary term, and it uses the value attribute to have da in the attribute value as opposed into the text. Again, from the DITA point of view, these are equivalent, and this is where you might want to, with your processor, do a test set up both of these ways of processing it and see which one actually gives you the better result. Because from, like I said, the good news is DITA has multiple ways to do it, and you have the option to choose, and it's not a matter of right or wrong, it's just which one will work for you. And then the index sort as element allows you to indicate where index terms should appear in the index. So this is really common and important for items that you want to appear in your index that do not necessarily start with the first letter. So things that have periods, or in this case, if you were doing a sort of elements and you didn't want the greater than, no, less than tag here, the actual, you can't see me pointing at my screen, of course. You want it to sort on data, not on the character before it. So in this case, with index terms, if you look in here, it says keywords, index term, it's in the XML element, data. Well, we want it to sort as data. And you would be able to put this in particularly for, a lot of folks use this if they're trying to index programming items or file extensions that you normally have a period in front of them. This allows you to have that type of control. So we're going to move on here to our next poll. So if you could give us our next poll, please, Adam. So we're going to move on and talk about when to translate content. And I want to know a little bit more about how you guys are currently translating your information and what your experience is.
So Amber, we'll leave the poll open for a couple more seconds, and then we'll be closing it momentarily.
Awesome. Thank you, Adam.
You're welcome. Okay, so 48% have indicated they responded yes, they have gone through multiple translation cycles. 16% is split between yes, they have sent their first content to translation, no, they have implemented DITA but not yet translated content, and no, they have not implemented but, oops, wait, yeah. No, they have not implemented but have translated other content source. And then 3% have said, no, this will be our first translation experience.
Okay, great. So for those of you who have done this multiple times, I'm hoping that a lot of what I'm talking about, you're just nodding along and saying, yeah, we know that, we do that. And this is a validation of what you're doing successfully. So, we just talked about what DITA has to offer. The question is, well, how do I know what to use when? Because, like I indicated, these are options that are available to you. How do you know which ones to use? So we're going to talk a little bit about that. You want to use that translate attribute when you need to specify that a specific element does not need to be translated. So, for instance, in this case, we have a Latin word that is in a term element, and the translate is equal to no. We have to indicate this because there might be other terms that could be translated. So it's this specific word is a Latin word and does not require translation. And you'll see that there are some pretty common elements if you're using the DITA specification in semantically identifying the content rather than using other mechanisms like manually putting in quotes and stuff. So for instance, for term, this is the element that you use to indicate that this is a newly defined word. And if you use that, we'll talk a little bit more about that with the power of the glossary specialization behind that. Phrase, keywords, and quotes. Keywords in particular, if they are items that are capital or proper nouns, things like that, a lot of times those may not be translated, but you can't globally say that, usually say, I should say, that don't translate any keywords. So this is where we would say, okay, we have the control to be able to indicate that specific items not be translated. The downside of this is that you have to manually go in and specify that for that specific instance, which could be a lot of work. So in a case where it is pattern-based, what we can do is say, oh, if there are elements where we know that you would never translate them, rather than going in and setting the translate equal no attribute, communicate to your translation vendor, these elements never get translated. Like I said, the positive about this is that it is done programmatically. It means that you don't have to go and do this manual work. Of course, the flip side of that is that it is programmatic, which means there's no flexibility unless you actually went in and said, okay, we say that we never translate code phrase. I want this specific code phrase to actually be translated. You could do that override. So this is why it's an architectural endeavor, is to look at the content and say, okay, which elements contain content that we would never translate? And a lot of times, for most companies that I work with, when they have code, they tend to write it in English. And when they provide code samples in their content, that doesn't get translated. Even if the surrounding content around it gets translated, the fact that it's in that code block, it's in English, and that's the language of technology that they're using, and so they're going to stay with it. The command name, possibly, var name in the software domain. So what you see in these first two bullets is there's a bit of a trend where these are things that are programmatic in terms of they're technology based, and that English has traditionally been one of the dominant languages of technology. If you don't need to translate it, then you can just say, hey, across the board, no. Trademark, if the trademark itself is not translated, then you say that for all your trademarks, say, no, we don't translate our trademarks. Then you could just tell your translation vendor, hey, don't translate these guys, and not have to go and specify translate equal no on every trademark. Again, this is something where you would need to work with your legal team to say, hey, do we need to translate our trademarks? If so, is it all of them? Is it none of them? Is it by the instance? And then you can make the call over whether or not this can be done as a blanket statement. So here's an example of a syntax diagram where we have all these elements, and this is not anything that most folks would actually ever translate. And so rather than having to go in and translate equal no on all of these, then we can just programmatically or blanket statement say, we don't need to translate this stuff. The other thing that you can do to help with your translation is to use the appropriate DITA elements. So I'm going to talk about some of the elements you can use and a little bit about the use of glossary topics. So the reality is that when I see people's DITA implementations, I see them using elements that are generic elements to indicate specific things. And they're compensating by applying manual formatting and things like that. So I thought it would be worthwhile to take a moment and just say, hey, these are some really important elements to use, because not only do they semantically identify the content for you to use in your display in your source language, but a lot of these things have generated items that go along with them that may vary by language, and that if you use the appropriate element, it helps you not only be really clear for the translator what it is you're talking about, but it also can help you when you go to publish in that other language, in that you could have a language-specific style sheet that automates the generation of some of those display items. So let's start with menu cascade. Menu cascade is the element that you use for when someone goes and selects an element, and then the drop-down element, the item, and then the next menu item. So file, new, topic would be 3 different UI controls nested within a menu cascade. The menu cascade then is the key for the processing to say, hey, I need you to generate the delimiter that is our standard in the source language between the UI controls. A lot of folks in English use greater than signs. Some use a post. I've seen some folks include graphics. But that, if you're using English, that's an English convention. If you're going to other languages, that is not the convention they use, and you do not want to have to be manually going in and stripping out and replacing that English language delimiter to put in the whatever's appropriate for that other language, because if you simply use the correct elements, and provide the right style sheet, that could all be automated. In addition, footnotes, how footnotes are generated. Some folks I see, they go in and use sup and sub and basically recreate their own footnotes, where if you use the DITA footnote, you can again leverage the automation of the numbering and the position and all those other things that may vary by the target language. Note with the appropriate type attribute. Again, the graphic that appears next to a note might be different if there is a graphic, or even how you present the label that in English says note. If you use the note element with the appropriate attribute value, that could all be automated. And again, it'll be clear for the translator, and it'll save you time when you're going to publish that translated content. Prereq is one of the other elements that has many times an associated label. We would, instead of just having a paragraph and then someone manually typing in, before you can start this task, you must blah, 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 blah. If you put it in the prereq element, then if you want it to be that type of a lead-in, it could be automatically generated. It could also simply be an icon. It could be a label. Again, that gives you both a benefit for your source language as well as your translated content. And then, so what I would like you to do is to think about any element for which you generate a label or a delimiter, and you should be thinking about your content, and go back and look and say, are we using the appropriate element that DITA provides for us? Or have folks kind of maybe made a shortcut to say, oh, well, it looks like this in our English output, so I'll just make it bold, or I'll just make it italics. Because any place where you've done that, you are, first of all, creating ambiguity for the translator, and then you're creating extra work when you go to publish that content in any other language. So I really wanted to mention the glossary support. For those of you who aren't aware, there's a separate glossary topic, and it can be related to a term element using a key reference. And what that does is it sets up this relationship that can be instantiated in your output any way that you need it to be. So for instance, in an online PDF, it could simply be that they click on the term in its representation, and it takes them back to a glossary at the back of the PDF. If it's online, it could be that it takes them to a separate HTML page. If it's in a mobile app, perhaps there's a pop-up that just shows them the information. If you're going to need to do this for multiple languages, it's really helpful to use the mechanisms that DITA provides. In addition, if you are using any type of an alternative, and DITA is very thorough about the options you have available, abbreviation, short form, acronym, it lets you say, hey, in this case, I want you to provide the shortened form, and maybe for the first instance, we want you to provide the full form plus the shortened form. So I'm going to show you an example. And you can relate this with a key reference to the abbreviated form. So if you have your glossary topic for anti-lock braking systems, you can see that the first instance would be anti-lock braking system, parentheses, ABS, parentheses. And that the first time it appears, I would want it to appear that way. And in the future, I want it to be ABS. Well, this is what it would look like in the concept topic that references it, that there's a key ref to ABS, and that the first time, let's say this concept topic is the first one that gets processed, the first instance would get the surface form, that is fully spelled out, and all subsequent instances of this abbreviated form with that association with the key ref would get the acronym. and the output would be as it shows below. Now, folks might say, well, that's a lot of work. Well, you know, the reality is that you don't need to use every mechanism, but what's powerful about this is that instead of having to go and create all these associations and map things back and forth with the different languages, by setting up this association, when the glossary topic gets translated and the concept topic gets translated, the association is still there, and and the reality is that perhaps the surface form is different in a different language and the acronym is different. Well, then you have the ability to make it that the processing can handle that for you in every target language, and that you don't have to go worrying, oh, did they catch it that it's different in French than it is in this case, if the source language were English. So I mentioned removing the ambiguity from the content model, and what I want to talk about is why this clarity is so important. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time on some guidelines, talk about some element usage, and then go through some of making sure that you have a single purpose for each element, avoiding manual formatting, and talking about a related topic, which is, should I use a specialization or an output class attribute? And of course, this will be a high-level discussion, but I think it's important that you think about these things. So the first thing to consider is what our goal is. We want to avoid using formatting elements, and as I said, it's one thing for, someone in the original language to go, oh, well, it looks, so for instance, it's a new term. So in English, we put that in italics. Okay, though, that's great if you do that, but what happens when it goes to translation and it goes to Japanese? Because Japanese doesn't have italics. So then the translator has to look at that and say, well, why did they make that italics? Oh, okay, because it's a term. And so then they have to strip out the italics and put in whatever formatting they need in Japanese. Whereas if you just had used the term element, they simply could have replaced the text within the element and not touched the formatting at all. So I'm a big fan of reducing your usage of formatting elements. And if you have to use a formatting element, use it for only one purpose. Maybe because DITA does not have an emphasis element. If you're going to use italics for emphasis, then it would be really clear that any time the translator sees anything in italics, they know that it is for emphasis and not any of the other things that it could be in English, which would be introducing a new term, it could be a citation, it could be, in some cases, a foreign word. Take out that ambiguity, and if you can use a semantic element rather than a formatting element, please do so. Don't use elements for multiple purposes. So again, this is the practice that folks tend to use with formatting elements, but other times the folks will use the same element for multiple purposes. I've seen folks use the same element, for instance, like code block to represent all kinds of things, and code phrase to indicate things like user input. Well, there's a user input element for a reason, and that is because its purpose is different than showing some representative code. And maybe when you originally start your content, you're like, oh, those look the same. They're both going to be a monospace font. I don't need to worry about this. But in the future, if you actually wanted to say, oh, we're going to import all of our code snippets into the content, well, if you've hijacked code phrase or code block for user input as well, then you can't do that. And so this is just a good practice for your architectures. Just use each element for a single purpose. Try not to type formatting things like quotation marks. If you need that type of formatting, allow the processing to do it based on the element, because quotation marks in English are not the same as how other languages represent a quote. And again, that becomes not just manual work for the translator, but it also means that when you have to go to do the display for the publishing, there's going to be more work there as well. Anytime we have to type a delimiter, such as an M dash or a colon, First of all, there's a consistency issue. You put 5 writers in a room and you give them all the same guidelines, and you know, despite their best efforts, you look at some lists and some of them may have different delimiters than others. Compound that but to where you're going to other languages where delimiters could be different just in general, and don't type them. Allow the element that contains the content to generate that delimiter for the processing. Please avoid adding unnecessary formatting that the processing can handle. And this is things like, oh, I'm going to type in part number and then a hash sign. Well, let's say that you've specialized a part number element. Well, if you need it to always be part number or hash sign, well, that's something that could possibly be automated. So maybe not, but you should look at this and say, why am I typing in this stuff? If I have to type in the same thing more than once, and I'm typing in it over and over again, then it's a really good candidate for automation. If you can avoid relying on output classes for element identification, that's ideal. The output class is there to send processing information to the processor. And you know, the thing about it is that unless you customize your interface, it's a manually entered value. And I can tell you that I can misspell pretty much anything I have to type multiple different ways. And that means that I'll get a surprise when I generate my output because it's not going to look correct. And one of my favorite sayings is nobody likes surprises at work unless it's cake or ice cream or money, right? So we don't want surprises in our output. So don't make me type something in when there's another way to handle it. So those are all the things not to do. What should we do instead? Again, each element should serve a single purpose. Use the element that actually identifies what that content is. Make sure that folks know exactly how they are to use the element so they can do so consistently. Update your style sheets to make this more efficient and leverage that element selection. And if you have to, if you can, it sometimes is worth it to specialize, and I'll touch on that a little bit later. So when I'm talking about having a single purpose for an element, you know, I do have to say you have to be reasonable. The reality is that, you know, there are some times when the distinction just isn't going to be warranted, and you know, you might in any given time period say, okay, we're gonna acknowledge that we're not doing the best practice, and you know, but not acknowledge it and do what makes sense for you. So for the guidelines, okay, be reasonable. We have to find that balance between clarity and complexity, which means that it's clear for translators and processors to know what they have and what they need to do with it. And it's not so complex that the author is tagging every other word and not actually getting, you know, feeling like they're actually typing anything. And we talked a little bit about those others. So the examples, for instance, use file path. If the formatting directory paths and file names is the same, then that's one that you can use for both purposes. You know, there are some folks that ask, well, do we need pre versus code block versus screen versus system output? Well, you know, what's the worst that happens if you do use code block? Well, you might endanger the future enablement of your content, but maybe you only need 2 of these, not 4 of these. Just because the spec has all these elements in it doesn't mean that you need to use them all. But keep in mind that if you do decide to essentially hijack an element for more than one purpose, that there could be unintended consequences down the path on your content. A quick example is for folks that are moving into DITA and using the DITA task topics. There are folks that say, oh, well, STEP has a lot of elements and I don't see why we need to use them all. Why don't we just put everything into STEP? We'll put the command in command and everything else we'll just put in info. And you know, that might work for your initial translation, initial conversion. And it might work okay for the first few years of your content. But if you ever need to take that content to a mobile app, if you have both additional information, examples, you know, the results, all of that in the info element, there is no way that the mobile app can actually display those different pieces because you didn't semantically identify them. I've had teams say, well, for our initial conversion, we're okay with that. We need to get over it. We need to be expedient into adopting the spec, adopting the standard, and then we can go back and refactor them if we need to. Yes, you can, but that will actually incur translation costs for you, because when it goes back out to translation, even if the words are the same, because there are different elements, it will get flagged that it's a different topic, and it'll get processed. And you've done it for the English, you would need to do it, if that's your source language, then you would need to do it for all the translated elements, the translated topics as well. So keep in mind that those shortcuts have cost, but you have to respond to your resources and your circumstances. So a little bit about clarity. So rather than, if I've seen folks use B because, oh, well, our UI controls are bold. Don't do that. It's ambiguous. Use UI control. Rather than typing in, putting it in quotes or putting italics, if it's a citation to another resource, use the cite element. And I talked a little bit about term already. I've talked a little bit about quote. I've used, rather than using code phrase or phrase, use file path. For footnotes, that's what the element's there for. Rather than faking caution, use the note type. These are the high instance elements where I see folks not use them and work around them, which it not only causes more work for you, particularly in this caution example, where it's actually a lot more work to go in and put all this together when you could just put it in the note type. But it causes a lot of aggravation, inefficiency, and additional cost for every language that you translate this content into. So that was for clarity. Now let's talk about what happens when you don't use the right element for display. So I talked a little bit about the menu cascade. If you instead say, oh, I'm just going to type into UI controls and manually put that delimiter in, well, again, you have to take care of that and do something different with it for every language, where if you follow the example on the right with the menu cascade and not try to manually put in the delimiter, then the processing can handle that for you downstream. Per language, again, you're saving per language. For a labeled list, I see people do this a lot, where they take a list item, they make it bold, because they want to have this label, they manually type in the delimiter, here is a colon, and then they just add their information. And this is what you can use definition list for. The definition DT element, definition term, says, hey, this is that area, this is the item that we want, and this is I want to highlight, and then this is its description. And is an architectural exercise, you say, well, how many flavors of these do we have? If you have more than one flavor of this, where you'd say, oh, well, if it's this type of a list, we would want the description to be on the same line as that labeled content, the operating systems, versus another use of a definition list where we say, oh, no, it needs to be separate. Well, then we'd have to think about, okay, well, how do we indicate which type it is? But I'll be honest, most folks' content doesn't seem to be that complicated. They just are doing some manual work where I think that they could better leverage the standard. And table headings. You'd be surprised how many folks just don't put in table headings. Instead, they basically manually create the heading row within the body. Do yourself a favor, use the T-head row, because that lets the processing know, hey, this is a heading. It not only helps when you have tables that if you're doing a book type output, that it keeps the header and repeats it, etc. But when that information needs to be presented in a different language, it's really clear. This is the heading. And although it might be bold in your source language, if it's not bold in the target language, then they have to go and manually address how that needs to be presented. So I've talked a little bit about specialization. For those who aren't terribly familiar with DITA, specialization is the ability to extend the base architecture to create elements that you need that aren't in there already. And it means that you have to create a new plugin. So there's work, and there is a consideration about long-term management and things like that. But what it does is it allows you to create new elements and attributes that are explicit for what you need. And what's nice about doing that is it removes the ambiguity, and in your element list, when folks are actually creating their content, that element appears right in your list like any other DITA element from out of the box. The output class attribute is an attribute that is available on many, but not all elements, that lets the element say, hey, this is what needs to happen here. And a lot of folks use it to indicate to the processing, hey, I need you to do something different here. I need you to give me an override on this instance of something. So folks ask, well, when do I need to specialize, or when can I just use output class? I tell folks to think about these considerations. The first is, if there is no DITA element that properly identifies the content that you need to identify, then it's a good candidate for specialization. If it's something that authors also have to do frequently, as opposed to, oh, we have 2 instances of this in 1 million topics, well, no, you're not going to specialize for that. But if you have it in every topic and authors have to use this construct every day, well, if you're asking them to use output class, then you either have to do some accommodation in your UI, or you're really high risk of folks not typing in the output class correctly. And if the authors need to specify the usage, so for example, if you say, wow, we have 3 types of definition lists that we want to have, well, you could say, oh, well, we have a definition list and we could put an output class on it, or we could say, oh, we're going to specialize the list type if you need it. Folks a lot of times use output class when you need to indicate a variation for formatting on an existing element. I just need you to have this element look a little bit different in this instance. Or it is being used and is so infrequent that it's okay that, you know, it's easy to verify, yeah, I remembered to put the output class value on and I typed it correctly. Or you can actually include it in your templates, which means that the authors don't have to worry about it. So for instance, if you say, oh, we have these types of lists, this type of list only occurs in reference topics. In our reference topic template, we will have a definition list with an output class of reference list. And the authors never have to type it. We get all the value of the additional semantic identification with none of the effort of having to specialize and none of the pain subjected to the author. So that's the way I look at it. And the real issue here is, when do authors have to have control over processing? So what the example here I put in was a collapsible expandable substeps. A lot of teams to say, oh, we have substeps. When it goes out to a mobile device, we expect them to be collapsible or expandable. Or other folks are like, no, we have to manually type that value. Well, then if you have that, you need to make it really easy for them to do. So here are some quick examples of items that I have seen folks specialize. For folks that are doing a lot of white papers for articles, they want to have a sidebar, different table types, again, that collapsible element. I've seen some folks actually say, we want an emphasis element, so we've created it. Foreign words to identify non-translated words. I had a publisher who does a lot of medical information, and they just needed to say, okay, this is a medical word that, you know, we don't want to have to say, you know, this is a term and translate equal no. We just said, okay, it's a Latin word or a medical word. Measurement that allows you to indicate the measurement unit so that you can then go and use it for actual calculations. Money to indicate the monetary unit, because in different languages, so for instance, in English, it's $1 period dot 50 cents. Well, that's not the same in other languages, and if you want to be able to automate that processing of it, some folks have found that valuable. I'm not endorsing that you need these, I'm just giving you examples. Last, I want to talk about avoiding inline referencing, and could you give me our last poll, please? So what I mean by inline referencing is, I'm going to go through the definition and then I'm going to talk about the issues and some best practices. And so while the poll's open, I'll just get started and talk a little bit about the definitions. When I refer to inline referencing in DITA, I'm referring specifically to content referencing, key referencing, and con-key referencing. Content references allow you to directly reuse or include content from one element into another topic. Key references allow you to indirectly reuse that content, more like a variable or a placeholder. And then the con-key references allow you to indirectly reuse the content based upon a condition. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because this is a pretty technical part of a concept to understand. And I highly recommend that if you want to know more about this, that you go directly to the DITA 1.3 specification and look at the overview and look at, they have a whole section on referencing so that you can learn all the details about how this works. So how are we on the poll?
So Amber, on the poll, 71% said yes, they use con referencing. 39% say yes, they use key reference. 29% say yes, they use content key reference. And 21% say they say no.
Okay. So for those of you who are saying no, these are mechanisms that are available to allow you to have element level reuse. If you don't have a business need for it, don't do it. If you do, as I indicated, DITA has multiple ways to help you handle that scenario. If you're going to do it, though, you need to think about some of these issues. So first of all, when you translate, there's article agreement in reused words or phrases. So in English, we don't have gender, but in a lot of other languages, they do. And then there's the difference between singular and plural, where if it's in English, it doesn't say it's the element or it's the elements. That is not the case in other languages. So if you're doing an inline replacement of a word, this could be very problematic when it goes to, for instance, to German. Capitalization. Well, we capitalize in English the first word in a sentence, but that's different. The capitalization in other languages is very different. And also the expansion of the abbreviated forms. If you want that to be automated, I definitely recommend that you consider going and looking at using the abbreviated form with a key ref in a glossary topic to see if you can automate that so that the abbreviations are handled correctly by the language. And then the inflection in the translated content, which is word changes by role in a sentence. So in English, we have our word structure. If any of you are old school and remember diagramming sentences, it's different in other languages. And if you replace a single word out of context, this can cause trouble in a lot of target languages. So if you are going to reference content, we highly recommend that you do it with a complete unit at the block element or a full sentence. We definitely can reference non-translated text, and you're pretty safe using proper nouns, particularly when they are the subject of a sentence. Do not reference common nouns if you can help it. And if you are translating text, it's just, if you can help it, I would avoid it because it causes challenge for you downstream depending on the language. So instead, if you have to do this, consider putting the article actually into the reference. So rather than just saying, instead of saying the blah, 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 and referencing the blah, blah, blah part, if the is part of that goes with blah, 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 put them together in that reference so that the article goes along with the noun so that when it gets translated, they can handle the fact that that might be different in a different language. If you can avoid using references as the first word of a sentence, that will help with the capitalization. So, for commands, streamline it, make it simple. Click OK instead of the OK button because we have an article that's hanging out here that would have to be accommodated based upon gender, and then it has to be handled with order. So these are considerations that you need to think about with your original content so that you don't accidentally create additional work in translation. So I walked through these 5 pieces, and I just really quickly wanted to say there are other best practices that, this about the global translation that has nothing to do with DITA specific. So that's why I didn't put it in part of the heart of the conversation here. And there I have 2 slides that are best practices resources that are available to you. I would highly recommend that you check some of these out. And I believe, Adam, that these slides will be available. This will be available online so folks can come back and see this.
Correct, beginning tomorrow afternoon.
Okay, great. So for those of you who are sitting there frantically trying to screen capture this, you don't need to do that. It will be available tomorrow. Like I said, I could not cover everything that is involved here. And some of this stuff is just around, like this section is just around best practices in general. And the second slide is really about best practices for DITA. And again, most of this is coming from the OASIS committee. And I'm going to give a plug that if you care about this and your company is an OASIS member, please join the DITA TC and get involved in some of these subcommittees. So we have time for a few questions. Did we get any questions, Adam?
Great. Yes, Amber, thank you indeed. The first question that has come in is, how do I handle presenting the same content, such as a measurement, in different ways based upon the country in which the content will be used?
Like I said, one of the options is that you could have an element that identifies it as a measurement. And then, I have one team that said, okay, we have measurement, and then within it we have both the imperial and the metric. And so they've basically they have a containing measurement element, and then an imperial element and a metric element. And for them, they actually went to the next level, which said not only is it imperial, but what unit of measure is it? So it's inches or feet, it's yards, versus in metric, it's meters, etc. And they chose to specialize this so that they had a lot of processing power, because they wanted to be able to identify this so that they could then use it for calculations. So when they had, for instance, a set of weights, then they could actually add them all up and say, and this entire kit will weigh this much because it has these pieces in it. So you need to look at your business requirements and say, wow, that seems like a lot of work. Well, maybe your business requirements don't need something that robust, and maybe simply having a phrase with an output class on it that says, phrase output class measurement would be fine. You need to, again, with all architectural decisions, look at your business requirements and see how complex they are to understand what it is you need to support.
Great, thank you, Amber. The next question has come in is, can I have language-specific ampersand output class values? So
can I have multiple output class values that are language-specific? Yeah.
Language-specific.
Yeah, and so the reality is that output class is an attribute. So, you can have multiple values, and, but there's not a way to put a condition on those. So if you needed to have something that was language specific, you would have to either have it be on separate elements, or I guess a kind of workaround that you could have would be to have the output class values actually include the language to which they apply. So EN dash, that would be the output class value, because you can have multiple of them on an output class. So that would be the workaround. There's no easy way that I know of, and if someone knows of a better way, please, follow through and follow up and give us the text about that. But I don't know of a way to make make it based upon this language without actually embedding that information into the value itself.
Great, thank you, Amber. The next question is, in the glossary example, where is the key definition for abs?
Okay, so if the glossary example is, I hope I'm not making anybody dizzy. All right, so we have our glossary example. What was the question?
Where is the key def for abs, or key definition?
Okay, so this is the key ref, the definition. Great question. The actual association happens in the map that contains the topic. So in the map, it would say you have a key, and it would tell the resolution would be indicated in the map that contains the concept topic. And then, so it would, actually, that's a great idea. I could, next time I have this, I could make sure I put in the actual map for the resolution, but it's happening at the map level. And the reason it happens at the map level is that you could have a different value, you could have a different pointer to what you want ABS to be in different maps. So for common items that have multiple, maybe abbreviation's not the best one, but for term, for instance, I know that a lot of companies have the same word used multiple times, multiple ways, like the word component can have different meanings. And so by having that relationship abstracted to the map, it's really helpful to be able to say, oh, for this map, we want to point to glossary topic 1, and this other map, we want to point to glossary topic 2. So it's in the map.
Thank you, Amber. I believe this is going to be a follow-up to it. Yes, at map, but what does adds, in quotes, adds A, B's, and boy, as Sam, point to? The ID for adds definition?
No, so what that's the piece that I didn't include in this. I failed as a professional communicator. That this is, so it's saying the abbreviated form, I want you to resolve this key with this reference, which is ABS, and in the map that contains and references this topic, it would have the syntax that says, the key ref equal, and then it would point to, it would say the key ref for ABS in this map point to ID ABS dash definition. So I showed it as these arrows are misleading in that it makes it look like it's a direct relationship, whereas that mapping actually occurs in the map where it basically says ABS equal ABS definition in this map.
Great. Thank you, Amber. The last question that's come in is, how do we translate content from different source languages?
The best way to, according to the best practices, is to use what we think of as a pivot language. So rather than going from French to German and German to Russian and Russian to Chinese and Chinese to Japanese, etc., instead say, okay, we're gonna write our language in multiple, our content in multiple different languages because that's what our business needs, and then we're going to translate for maybe all of the Romance languages into German. And then from German, we will translate out into other languages. Or if you're, you might say, oh, we're going to have all of our double byte character languages come into English, and then from English, it goes out into our double byte character set languages. So that way you have a baseline that, multiple languages come into one, and then from one, they go out into others, as opposed to hopping from one to another, because that allows you to have a translation memory from, for instance, from German into English, and then from English into something else. You don't have to, like English into Chinese, you don't have to have it from German into Chinese. So that allows you to be able to exercise and take advantage of those translation memories.
Great. Thank you, Amber. And thank you, everyone, for attending today's webinar, the last of 2017. This will conclude today's broadcast. You'll be able to access the recorded version of this webinar in the webinar archive section on our website, located at www.dclab.com. Our next webinar, the first for 2018, will be Tuesday, January 9th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, titled Web Scraping Science to Art, being presented by Richard Dominelli, Lead Software Engineer, DCL, and Alan Lieberman, Senior Project Manager at DCL. We wish you a safe and wonderful holiday season and a happy new year. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.
Thanks. Bye.